All right, welcome all of you to Hutchinson Modern Contemporary. And we're here tonight to celebrate Freddy Rodríguez. And I have to thank Professor Alejandro Anreus to be here this evening. Thank you for speaking with us about your long and cherished friendship with Freddy. Very lucky because we actually have Mary Rodriguez is here this evening. So I think it'll be interesting at the end if you're willing to give us a few comments after our chat here. The idea is that we're going to have a little conversation for 45 minutes, and then after that we have time for questions. Then there's wine and water afterwards, just in spending some time together too. But I would like to say before we start that the reason I have this gallery, as I like to say, small but mighty, is because of Freddy. And it was Freddy Rodríguez who basically gave me the encouragement and the idea, so I am forever grateful. And I also have to thank Laura Blanco, who's in the back, who had said to me years ago, why don't we go and visit Freddy's studio? And then that's sort of what got everything going. So I'm grateful to many, and I'm very happy to see you all here tonight. So I'm not going to be reading your biography,
Please
your CV, too long, very interesting, but that's not, tonight we won't, but I'm going to start off with sort of the most basic question. Can you tell us about when you first met Freddy?
Well, it's one of these interesting things that you meet the work of the artist before you meet the artist. So when I was 18, I went to Caimán Gallery and I saw an exhibition of Freddy that threw me off because era una partida de gavetas. And I couldn't quite figure out what they were about until, of course, years later that I realized he was working with a grid already, with these drawers, right? And then, of course, same place, I went back years later and I saw a very powerful exhibition of abstract painterly forms that were clearly erotic. I followed the work and I bought a little show and tell. I followed the work. This is how you know how old I am and how old I know Freddy, okay? So I'm going to actually pass this around. My son is here, so if you take this with you, you don't want to deal with a Polish, Cuban, Sicilian kid. So, but I just want to pass it around because here you have kind of in a nutshell a series of images that give you a range of Freddy like into the early 90s. And the fact that I encounter many of these exhibitions in many group shows, and there's one in particular that I love. Thomas Messer canta boleros en el paraíso. Thomas Messer sings boleros in paradise. And it's just an incredibly rich and dense painting. So anyway, I followed his work for years. And then in November of 93, just as I was about to leave indenture servitude from the Montclair Art Museum, I went to an opening of Vienen por las Islas at Algira. And there was Freddy and Mary and the girls, which of course are no longer girls, they're women. And we got into a whole conversation. And within the week, my kids hate it when I do this stuff because it shows you how really old I am. He sent me this. This is before there were phones and before you actually did this shit on, like, what do you call it?
Paper.
Paper and, paper, right? And it's how to get from New Jersey to Queens. Okay? And I still have this, okay? And before you know it, I visited him within just a few months of being at the Jersey City Museum. And in 95, did the first exhibition there. And this is where I do have to write the dates down because, this is where having smoked a little too much weed in high school catches up with you. The first exhibition was in 95, The Spirit and the Flesh, which dealt with sexual abuse in the priesthood. Then in 1999, my favorite exhibition of his of all time, and I hope someday that we can do some massive book on it, En esta casa Trujillo es el jefe, in 1999, and that one traveled to Museo de Arte Moderno in Santo Domingo and the Pontificia Universidad Católica in Santiago. And then in 98, my alma mater asked me to do a show of Latino artists, and it just happened that I, again, won the lottery, right? I invited mi hermano Juan Sanchez, the late Paul Gardner, and Freddy. And it was called Three from the Caribbean, New York, okay, in 1998, right? And that was basically the beginning of constant visits to Queens. And I have to tell all of you something, I'm sure Mary won't mind. Freddie was a great cook. And my son David, who was my companion on many of the studio visits. So the great thing was, and I think Armando Guillermo is here, and he came with me on a visit. After a wonderful visit in the studio, looking at art and having all this great conversation, then Freddie would make lunch. And we would have another extensive conversation over that. So that's a couple of days ago, and this comes back. This is not going to be typical Cuban stream of consciousness. Maria Brito, a great artist and dear friend, passed away. And Chon Noriega sent me this long email. I'm going to control myself. He said to me, Cano calls me Dominicano, and I call him Gano because I call him, he's the only Chicano Gusano from Miami. So he said, Cano, how fortunate you and I have been, that our lives have been blessed by people like Maria and Freddy and Juan and Luis Cruz Zaceta and many of you in this room. And once in a while, and the Garcia sisters, yes. Once in a while, and Roca, once in a while you realize that there are artists that become your family. And so I was very fortunate that that was Freddie. I mean, Freddie, we would talk regularly without any transactional thing being involved. We would always be, yes, I told you, show and tell, exchanging, okay? Because we actually had the records, right? And we would talk about obsessions, right? That's why I said to Isabella, I think calling it Freddie's Obsessions would be great, right? John Coltrane, my favorite things, right? How could you take something simple and do something extraordinary with it, right? And of course, our great passion, Mondrian, which of course, Freddie always used to tell this story. We did not know whether it was apocryphal or not, of Mondrian and Torres Garcia having a conversation in a Parisian cafe, and Mondrian basically telling Torres Garcia, you know what the problem is with you? You don't dance, man. Because Mondrian was a great dancer, an obsessive dancer, by the way. Okay.
So was Freddie.
And so was Freddie, right? And then, of course, the big kahuna, right?
Yes.
El cronopio mayor, right? Cortázar. Freddie would say over and over the years that if there was one overwhelming influence over everything, it was this guy. His sense of play, his sense of political commitment, and the most significant thing, which I think Freddie's a perfect example of that. You do not become a prisoner of style. You do with style what you want.
Your series.
Exactly.
His series, yeah.
And because your vision is your vision. And the vision is something that will be inherently present in the style without ever becoming a prison.
And in his studio, there's still the sign, hay que
Hay que
leer
leer a
Cortázar.
Cortázar.
It's like the rule of the studio, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I always find it interesting as you discover more parts of the different facets of a person. Did you know right away that Freddie was so curious about all sorts of topics?
It was something that I got right away. And what I also, again, found so fascinating is that the people that he connected with were very similar to him, right? People like Casaceta, people like Juan, right? These are artists who do research, who read literature, who read history, who have a critical outlook on society, who are obsessive listeners to music. And then a person who was not a Latin American by blood, but she was in spirit, our dear Jean Courtesy Smith, who was also part of our tribu, as my daughter and my son calls it. He had this uncanny ability to pick up something that he read in like a page, and 2 weeks later he's emailing me, I'm reading this, and that because I read this reference and I wanted to find out what it was about.
And it's interesting, you're seated right below this painting that has the clippings from the newspaper. And Mary, we've spoken about this, how he was so careful picking out, going through, finding just the right articles, right?
He had the sensibility and the intelligence of a historian, but one who was a poet, right? And for this series specifically, he and I would always joke with each other because I would say to him, what kind of a Dominicano are you that you don't drink coffee? Okay, he was a tea drinker. Right? And he would say to me, well, what kind of a Cubano are you that you don't like baseball? And what I found fascinating about this series as he was constructing it was that on the one hand, yes, there's no doubt it's a celebration of the sport, but there's this profound post-colonial reading of reality that here you have this small island of people of color dominating the sport in the empire, right? So it's, and the way he does it with such irony and class, and his ability to, you know, go back and forth between different mediums.
And the interesting thing is, since we live with this work coming to the gallery every day, it's actually remarkably silent. It's actually very calm. It's sort of interesting because it is about movement and the players and very different palette, but there's something actually very soothing about it.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I think it's so interesting how he was always so proud about color, and he always said that in the end he was a colorist and how much he loved beauty, and he studied textile design at FIT. So would you talk with him about color?
We talked about color all the time. We talked about difficult colors. He would always say green is the most difficult color. And of course, with Freddy's usual lucidity, he would say, you know, only a handful of people can handle green. Matisse, Bearden, Jacob Lawrence, and me. And I would agree with that. But I also think what's interesting is that going back to color, the whole idea is that he was also a painter's painter. Okay? Because I want you to look at these paintings closely and the works on paper. Of course, there's all this incredibly rich context and content, but he was really a painter's painter. When you get up close, you see the layers of paint. Obviously, like many of you, you know, I've been to the Museum of Modern Art a million times, but to me, one of the most revealing things was to go to a museum with him, and Juan Sanchez. I remember a great outing we did to the Brooklyn Museum to see a Caribbean show and talk about, you know, the stars were aligned. We're walking through the gallery, and who do we see but stars like Susana Leval and Julia Herzberg.
Oh.
Also, there's a photograph to prove that we were all there at the same time. And he would always help me look at paintings differently. For example, Broadway Boogie Woogie. He would say to me, get as close as you can before the guard pulls you away. And you will see that this is a sensually painted work. These are layers and layers of paint. These aren't just lines.
Right.
This isn't just a grid. So it's this whole sense of being a colorist, being a painter's painter, right? That I think is so important to see him in that larger frame too.
I find it so interesting, and he always, as I said, would speak about the great pride that he had in his new series. And I was always wondering when you knew that something was percolating of a new idea of a new series. Was it sort of a subtle transition, or he would just announce like his next series?
He would say, I'm reading this. Like for example, when I first met him, he said to me, I'm reading all this stuff about sexual abuse and pedophilia, and I'm deciding to do a series of paintings. Now this is November of 1993. And so of course, you know, typical Freddy, what's your position in the Catholic Church? I said, well, I'm a Catholic, but I disagree with 90% of the BS in the Catholic Church. And then he said, when you come to the studio, I want to show you what I'm thinking about. And then, of course, thinking about was, you know, he had read already like 3 books on it. He had all these articles. He was following how it was developing, how the bishops were not dealing with it in 1993. And so all of that informed his entire approach to that series of pictures. And of course, what's extraordinary about those pictures is that on the one hand, they're about paint, and there is an embedded criticism of the abuses of the church. But there's also some of those vestments that are incredibly gorgeous celebrations. I mean, my favorite, and of course this reveals maybe a little too much for people who know me in this room, was the Jesuit. No comment from my son, okay? Because it's a painting that seems to be in black. But when you really look at it deeply, there's layers of purple and blue and gray. And it just reverberates as just pure paint. And of course, the pure paint then pulls us in to this larger narrative of what are these paintings about? What is he telling us about society, right?
And I think also, in addition, he always talked about the content and his abstraction, but also like his craftsmanship, that when I have had to give a condition report on some paintings, not because anything was wrong, but it was for a future purchaser, each time the restorer would say, my goodness, this is in such incredible condition. And he took such pride in that. And everything really holds up so well. The series that he did that actually involves garden soil, that has to do with the, the sphere, with the planet, with
and
all
La
that.
Conquista and the islands, yes.
And they are just splendid. They're perfect. They still are. And so I think that whole beyond just the topic, the concept, but also the actual, the manufacturing.
Well, he not only did he have technical manuals in the studio, but he was always researching technical issues, and he was trying to figure things out, and he would do experiments that then ended up being resolved in the work. So he had a real sense of the craftsmanship.
Yes.
And it's so interesting because, of course, he's a great abstract painter. To me, he's just a great painter, period. But he would always say that he didn't like a lot of abstract art because it wasn't that good. And for him, it wasn't that good because it didn't have the craftsman rigor, that it wasn't well painted, that it wasn't well thought out. And I think that's a really significant thing in his entire body of work. But sort of going a little backwards to your previous question, it was so interesting that, of course, when he became obsessed with gold and he applied for this fellowship and he went to the Smithsonian to research, I mean, he was reading everything. Everything about gold. And also the other key thing that was a constant for us, and for us, I mean for him, for Juan, for Luis Cujas Aceta, is the whole idea of dictators, right? When you're born under dictatorship, when you suffer experiences of exile, and of course, some of you may say, wait a minute, Juan Sanchez was born in Brooklyn. Yeah, Juan Sanchez is an exile in Brooklyn, okay? All you gotta do is hear the man. He has been saying this for the past 35 years, all right? So this also informed how we looked at everything, right? Los dictadores, el colonialismo, the lack of democracy.
He was looking at a lot of human nature.
Of course.
Yeah.
And the problems that brings to the culture at large, right? The narrow-mindedness, the chauvinism, and how do you discern that? For me, one of the extraordinary things about that body of work in Esta Casa Trujillo es el Jefe is that they're abstract paintings on the surface, but they're not.
And there are many of them have a grid.
They all have a grid. They all have a grid. I remember when we laid out the show in Jersey City, Carmen Ramos was visiting, and we're walking around, and we turned around to each other and we said, the grid's everywhere here. The grid is everywhere.
And Rocio, you did a beautiful exhibition.
Great exhibition in the Bronx.
Yes. I think it's so interesting, to get an insight into the personal side of an artist. I think that we learn a lot by looking at the art. But I find that your relationship, and speaking about this, that it always helps us in the gallery, understanding the artwork that much more. And I think many times Freddy also did feel frustrated.
Yeah. He felt very frustrated with the art worlds and the way the art world functions, and it's so interesting because one of the things that I always think when I think of him, when I think of Juan and all these other extraordinary artists who are here also, is that curators, and I'm all for theory, and I'm all for having the vision thing and all that. But my mother always used to tell me this phrase, and if some of you came to my presentation at the Cervantes, I apologize for repeating it like a broken record. My mother would always say, sin santos no hay misa. So if you're an art historian or a curator, you don't have the artist. You may have the most wonderful ideas in the world, but you don't have anything. And I think we have this tradition that sort of goes a bit counter to what I would call the postmodern establishment tradition, right? And we have a great example of that in Susana Leval, right? Who was always interviewing the artists, who was always visiting the artist studios, not the galleries, nothing against galleries, but the importance of having a direct connection with the artist. And I think Freddy was always very frustrated with the idea that some curators were afraid to get too close to the artists. Send me slides back in the days when you would send slides.
And he also talked a lot about how people would think about his work. I think he did think a lot about how his work would be remembered, or how it would be described. That's why he always said, an art historian's going to have a really hard time talking about me because I have so many series. But I still think that there's quite a steady line of quality, and his paint, the way he painted, like the color choices, like they are all connected.
I think as a colorist, as a painter, the perpetual use of the great, and I've always thought that there's this notion of, there's certain basic tenets in the ideas of modernism, right? For example, no matter how you look at Rivera, underneath Rivera, there's always going to be a cubist understructure, okay? And I think when you look at Freddy, and also when you look at Juan, there's a grid. And I even said to you the other day when we were in the studio, I said, Isabella, you need to do a show of the grid in Freddy and Juan. Because it served the same role as Cubism did for Rivera and those modernists of the early 20th century. This grid, which then you're able to take apart. You're able to dismantle. You're able to, throw it in the corner. You're able to pick it up and restructure. And so his ability to take that and do with it what he wanted. And then this whole notion of abstraction, right? What is abstraction? Yes. Many years ago, and this person was long gone, and my grandmother always told me, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything. Sort of confronted him in a gathering and said, well, what kind of a Latino artist are you? Your work is not political. And some of you may remember, and actually I think I can pass these around because these are it. Oh, yeah. So then he did a series in 99 to 2000 called Political Statement. Okay?
Yeah.
And they are these extraordinary
these
great paintings. Who are you to tell me what I can do, and who are you to tell me whether it's political or not, right? And then, of course, doing those paintings, this notion of his obsessions, everything came back, everything was embedded, right? What was he listening to when he was doing these paintings? He was listening to Coltrane, he was listening to Mingus, he was listening to Dizzy Gillespie, to Miles Davis. So the keys between the keys are there visually.
And then also in that series, he was looking at the sort of pharmaceutical companies. Mm-hmm. He was looking at that, about how through these grids, there's a whole structure, and the human being might be just one little red line at the bottom. So there was always, as I said, he was always thinking a lot about what's fair,
about everything,
right?
Yeah,
right?
About everything.
And I'm sure obviously his early drawings too. Yeah. Beautiful sketches.
It's interesting because I always liked the idea of seeing more of his drawings. And he didn't really exhibit them that much. Rocio did a beautiful selection of drawings when she did the show in the Bronx, because he would do these exquisite drawings with color pencil that were just so subtle, and you could really see his mind at work defining the space, moving the shapes.
Well, in the first show that I did here, in fact, the gallery opened up with the Freddy Rodríguez show, and we showed some of his early collages, which he had never shown before. And then we realized that one of these pieces in the collage was actually a MoMA members calendar, and like half of the envelope was in one collage, and we found the other half in another collage.
And there's this subtle and sometimes not so subtle institutional critique embedded in some of those paintings, like the Thomas Messer Cantando Boleros en el Trópico, en el Paraíso. The back of the paintings are collages of the advertisements in the art sections of the New York Times. Okay, and so he's layering on top of that all of these colors, all of these stains, these flowers, and again, the long view connection, right? What he did in those collages, he was in effect doing exactly what Picasso did in his collages, which when they were closely studied by Patricia Layton a number of years ago, they found out that these weren't accidental pieces of paper. They were about strikes, anarchists, all kinds of political turmoils taking place in Spanish Africa. And so the fact that Freddy's doing this great critique of institutionalism of the art world, right?
And also a misunderstanding of the Dominican Republic and its
completely.
History.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that.
A number of years ago, I'm sure many of you knew about it and probably read it, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz, which is a wonderful book. I read it in 2 plane rides back in the day when I was honored to be on the board of the Joe Mitchell Foundation. We were going to some conference. But as I was reading it, I realized this is great literature. I said, but Freddy has already done this in painting like 25 years ago. And I think that's also what's significant, right? That there's this entire body of work that has been done. And that, of course, is being acknowledged and is being looked at and is being placed where it belongs. And that it's, the word is, it's canonical. As you know, I'm honored to be working on an exhibition that opens next June. Yes, you're all going to be invited at the Phillips Collection, and it's the first major survey show of Juan Sanchez, which will then come to the Whitney Museum and then go on to Puerto Rico. And one of the things that one of my co-curators, the marvelous Tia, Georgima, because he tells me, don't say it like a Cuban, Jojima, it's Georgima, who's not here because she's in Venice. She said to me, you know what we have to start saying about people, artists like Juan, artists like Freddy, et cetera, they're canonical artists. They're canonical to contemporary art. And that is exactly what we have to start saying. And so you see there in how he deals with collage, right? The tradition that can be traced all the way back to Picasso and Braque, stopping at Motherwell, right? And then moving on to Bearden and having this rich conversation. That's part of the canon. And that he is part of that canon. So.
And very interesting, the whole history of New York, because as we do our study rooms that we have on our website, the gallery, as we do this deep research, I learn about all the connections between so many of you, and I think it's interesting to see also how New York has changed their view, for better, for worse sometimes, and that history too.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting because I think, again, this particular group of artists, they really are also New York artists.
Yes.
I mean, Freddy's a New York artist, Juan is a New York artist, Asacete is a New York artist, et cetera, et cetera. And that's essential in defining them. And the fact that, they have been subverting the narrative from day one, right? And now finally the narrative is waking up, right? Better late than never, that's what my kids tell me.
And then
un viejo cascarrabia, but still.
And then also we have mentioned Elizabeth, the beautiful show that you did at Brick about Latinx abstraction, where there were Freddy's, like the early work from '74, and then the more recent, the Gold series, both geometric.
Yeah, it's a whole, I would say it's a whole aspect of Latinx art that gets ignored, because we're meant to kind of think about Latinx artists in terms of the iconography or certain expectations, and it's not for abstraction, which is one of the reasons why Freddy has been less understood.
Yeah, and at the same time that you look at what he was doing in the 70s, and you can see, Frank Stella was doing, in my view, slightly, second-tier minimal work compared to what he was doing. Not just in the sense of the painterliness and the color that Freddy brought to it, but the substantial content.
Yes, and
because it was the entire history, you could say, is reflected in those paintings. But again, it's our limitations in seeing abstraction in a certain way, and he was one of the people who really has been changing that all along.
But I was so observant. Always, a lot of them, or some of the early abstract paintings, he was looking at all the rebar of the buildings that was going up. He was looking downtown, what was changing in the city. I think he reflected a lot of just what he was looking at, right?
And what happened to New York between the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, right?
Can you talk at all about the 2028 exhibition that you're working on?
Well, I'm a guest curator. No, I'm not a guest curator. I'm a guest essayist.
The one about
at
Freddy.
the National Gallery.
Yeah.
And Carmen Ramos is doing this extraordinary exhibition dealing with geometry in Freddy's work. And a number of us have been honored to write about his work. And I've been asked to write about his relationship with literature. And because, of course, I'm a writer, but also, like him, I was an obsessive reader.
And you're a poet.
Some people say that, but as my daughter tells me, you're only a poet in Calle Ocho and Versalles at a certain time of the day. And those of you who know what I'm referring to, you know exactly what I mean. But here I have something that I found that I said, I really have to share this with you because I think it tells you something about his thinking. Yeah, here it is. The importance of literature for him, right? Now, he told me that when he first got here, he just read literature in English because he wanted to improve his English. So it was, the classics, Hemingway, Faulkner, Dos Passos, Henry Miller, Norman Mailer, and then he would say to me, a lot of guys, a lot of testosterone, too much testosterone. And I think that's important to understand, because I think the fact that Freddie was married to a strong woman, that he had 2 strong daughters, that gave him a particular sensitivity about that, which for Latino men of our generation, it's, I think, something, pretty significant, right? So here, just, there's an email from 2012. Querido Alejandro. Okay, aquí está. I'll translate. Dear Alejandro, here it is. Very quickly, I just sat down and I've come up with titles that I have used in my work that are inspired by books that I have read over the years. Boquitas Pintadas, Manuel Puig, very well-known Argentinian novelist. Cambio de Piel, Carlos Fuentes. Despertar en el Trópico, obviously a reference to Cabrera Infante, Vista Amanecer en el Trópico. El Corazón del Quijote, Cervantes, El Jardín de al lado, Donoso. Espejismo o Pedro Páramo, Rulfo. Fuego en el Llano, Rulfo. La Casa Verde, Vargas Llosa. La otra región más transparente, Carlos Fuentes. Los funerales de la mamá grande, García Márquez. Los perros del paraíso, which is a great novel by Abel Pose about Columbus and his encounter with the Caribbean. But then Freddie was able to sort of pivot from that into the series about Trujillo. Because in the end, it is all this long history of caudillismo, right, that has been inherited from Spain. Mulata de Tal, Miguel Ángel Asturias, Nostalgia Bolero, Cabrera Infante, Paradiso, Lezama Lima, Los Pasos Perdidos, Alejo Carpentier. So this is just a preliminary list. And what I think is also fascinating is that for him, this wasn't about illustrations, right? This was about evocations, ideas, feelings that these narratives brought to him, and how he was able to express them and resolve them visually, right? Not descriptively, but expressively.
You just reminded me of something. He was such a voracious reader. I mean, he used to grab the times before I could read it, I would go crazy. He would cut things out, and every Christmas I would go to Macondo on 14th Street and get his present, and I would come back with an armload of books, and he would finish them in a week. I mean, I don't know if you remember Macondo, but it wasn't cheap.
Yeah, it wasn't cheap.
But that was his Christmas
Yeah, of
present
course.
every year.
But when you bring that up, it makes me think of something, because you were talking about a certain series, or when he was doing the series about the Catholic, about the Church and the Conquest. There is the cross, which has ground glass in it. And so Freddie was saying, if you get too close to the Catholic Church, you can get hurt. So he told me the story about using the kitchen blender to do that.
And the air compressor. We went to my daughter worked in Nashville for a while, and we went to Nashville, an auction of farm machinery, and I swear to God, Freddie bid on this air compressor, thinking that he was going to use it to move the paint on the canvas. I mean, I said, what are you, crazy? How are we going to get this back to New York? But we did. I mean, his mind was 20 steps ahead of everybody else.
And he did use that compressor for like his tsunami series,
Yeah.
for different series, and your hair dryer.
Yeah, and the paintings about nothing too, which I think are these amazing paintings where he's using the hair dryer and the compressor.
Yeah, it's interesting, very playful, but then also super precise, because I'm very clear about who was allowed to touch his paintings, how they were stored, which art handler was allowed. Thankfully, he liked mine, our famous Pedro, who was allowed to go in, but he took such good care of his paintings.
Well, for him, art was everything.
Yeah. And
I think that brings to the whole idea of the playfulness, but also the clarity, the precision, the rigor. I think one of the reasons why he loved jazz so much was because of that, right? That jazz gives you improvisational room, but it is also, you could say, very classically grounded, right? You have to know what you're doing in order to improvise.
Right.
And he was very conscious of that.
I went on the trip also with Mary down to Chile when he showed in Santiago his gold series. And you were there, Julie. Yes. And it was so nice to see how proud he was. He loved his paintings. He really,
Same thing
felt.
in Japan.
Yeah.
when he met with the Empress.
Yes.
And the Empress spent about half an hour with him going through the paintings one at a time. She spoke English, so he just explained all the paintings. That was the series about the tsunami.
Yes.
The tsunami series. I mean, he was proud of his work. He worked so hard. My God.
And then
I mean, I would come home from work at the end of the day, and he would look like he had been through the wars. Like his face was drained. He was so exhausted from working. You know what it is. You really work.
can you just talk a little bit about the memorial?
Oh, yeah.
Which
he
was
spent
done in
an
Rockaway?
entire year with the families.
Because I don't know if everybody
Yeah.
knows about that
Yeah.
part of his work, the
Well, he did the
Public
memorial
memorial.
for the flight
American Airlines
of American Airlines,
Flight.
which is out.
to the one in Rockaway, right?
Yeah.
And for the Dominican Republic, that was November
And
12th.
not only did he meet with all of the families, but he made sure that there was a bit of every person that died embedded in that memorial. And of course, what I think is so beautiful about it is that, again, here he's using a grid in
Yes.
this architectural structure, and yet he's humanizing the grid with all these openings and closings where there's all of these elements that are bits of people's lives.
And a beautiful line
Yeah.
also,
Yeah.
right, of a statement.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting that he had this ability to constantly, like Mary said, he was 20 steps ahead and interconnecting things from here and there. He was doing a painting, he was talking to you about whatever he was reading at the time. Or, I remember going to visit him when he was doing the paintings about nothing, right? And show and tell. So he says to me, I bought you a book, right? He said, I just finished reading it. You have to read it. This is the last lectures Carvarnedo did on abstraction. And then we're going to discuss it. Because his painting's about nothing. And I said, wait a minute. Paintings are about something, right? The curator, right? It's a concrete. Said, no, this painting's about nothing. So I'm having a tough time with this, right? And this is how smart this guy was, right? As well as how well he knew me. He says to me, Coño, think of Santa Teresa of Avila, the nothingness before God. So, that's the kind of person that he was and he is. And, and he would do things like, so not only did he get me the book, Juan does the same thing, by the way. Then he had cut out this interview in the New York Times on Carvarnedo that he sent to me.
MoMA's boy.
That says a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it was just this rich ability to connect everything.
Did you ever have something that you really couldn't agree on?
I'm trying to think. Maybe it had to do with Grace. Because he said to me that he was getting close right before he became ill, that he was getting close to seeing that Grace was everywhere. And I said to him, well, it is everywhere. And he said, no, I need more proof. But I think he had more than enough proof in the love of his wife and his daughters and his friends.
True.
Could you talk a little bit about the loyalty of friendship? We talked about this the other night. The show in Miami that it was Juan, your poetry, and Juan did the paintings. And Jean was there, she was having a show, so you were all together. And who shows up dressed to the nines?
Oh.
He always looked
Freddy.
like the president of the republic. What can I say?
Yeah.
The hat, the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I said, wow, Freddy. I said, oh, we didn't know you were going to be in Miami. So good that you were here. He said, no. He said, I came to be here. I said, you came all the way from Queens to Miami just to see this show?
Yeah, to support Juan and support me and support
He
Jean.
said, absolutely. He said, I wouldn't miss this for the world. And I think you started crying.
Of course.
To see him there. It was like,
He came from my mother's funeral mass, for God's sake. I mean, what more can you say about a friend, right? And even though he was ill, when, thanks to the idiocy that our country's going through, I was told I had to take early retirement by my university, Freddy, who was seriously ill, would call me every 2 weeks just to see how I was doing. And he even said, look, if you need to, I'll give you a painting, you can sell it. I mean, that's the kind of friendship that he had. But talking about loyalty and friendship, I want to tell a story. because I have a witness here, because he participated in it. A number of years ago, I did this exhibition at my old alma mater, Kane College, called Three from the Caribbean, New York, right? So there was only enough money to pay the artist and have a panel, which is fine. And we had a panel discussion, and a lot of students came. And so Paul and Freddie and Juan, and I just, directed the panel and discussion. Then we finish, and I don't know, maybe because I went there as an undergrad, which, by the way, Edward Sullivan has the wrong information in the book, saying that I studied with him in NYU as an undergrad. I went to King College. I studied with Alan Wallach. I was a working class kid. I couldn't go to NYU. And the funny thing is that this young woman gets up, and I can see Juan smiling because we talked about this not that long ago. And instead of asking the artist question, she says to me, Anreus, how many sugar mills did your family lose in Cuba? And before I could open my mouth, both Freddie and Juan said, no. He lost something more important than that. They stole a revolution from his family. Now that's when you know who your friends are. So I know that if I'm in a trench, I know a New Yorker guy in Brooklyn that I can always call on. And it was also that he had the courage of his convictions. Like I have seen him tell people, no, you're completely wrong about this. You're missing the boat about this. Don't rewrite the history. Look at the history.
Yes.
I mean, I can only tell you the back and forth between us after the election of 2016 over the phone. I mean, it was like, we're constantly doing comparisons with Trujillo and Fidel and the narcissistic egomaniac.
Well, one of the paintings that you showed, Elizabeth, is also referencing Trump, I think.
Yes.
It
I'm
did,
trying to-
yes.
That's right, yeah. And I can't remember the details right now.
We have the catalog out below the monitor. But I'm wondering if any of you in the audience have a question for Alejandro.
I have a question.
All of them.
So, quick comment and a question. Quick comment is the memorial in Queens. All the admiration I had for Freddie and respect, when I saw that, I'm like, how the hell did he do that? I mean, he never had that experience of doing such a large work. And it was just so successful, both on a formal level and a emotional level. So, but connecting that to sculpture, you didn't mention any of I think there was at least 2 sculptures here, and he occasionally did sculpture.
Yeah.
And what
And-
do you think he
and-
had the same sensibility?
I think he had the same sensibility. I think what he told me was that the issue with sculpture is that it was technically, from the point of view of materials, much more expensive. So he couldn't do it as much as he could do paintings, but he had sculptural elements even before he did these. There's a number of paintings where he did these masks that are embedded in the canvas.
Yeah.
That he did in the late 80s too.
His
So,
shaped
absolutely.
canvases.
And his shaped canvases are very sculptural.
Vestment series, I know that, like he made those stretchers.
Yeah, those stretchers were all handmade.
But
Your comment about the monument, I think, also shows you something too about the kind of mind that he had. That he did this incredibly rigorous homework from a technical point of view. Yes, he had technical people that did the physical labor, but he knew everything that needed to be done, the precision of everything. And I was just blown away by his ability to do that. Because he had, like you said, he had never done anything like that before.
But I think he had many projects that he wanted to do,
He
including
always wanted to work
film.
bigger. He used to
Yes.
say, I don't have enough space. This
That's
is a
not-
perennial problem. I need more space. So first it was the garage, then it was the basement, then it was the attic. And our whole house is really Freddie.
Yeah. But I know he was interested in doing public sculpture, interested in
Films.
movies,
Yeah,
right?
films.
He always wants to do, but I think, in that sense, I think it's beautiful that he always was positive, always thinking of more.
This constant explosion of creativity. And there was also this mirth about him. Juan and I, who maybe are a little bit more dour, Juan and I always said that Freddie was always smiling. Freddie, and we told ourselves after he passed that we need to learn to smile like Freddie, because he was always a presence of joy. And I think that's important, particularly in the world we live in, right? It's important to be a presence of joy. And his work,
Yes.
even at its most rough, I mean, some of those Trujillo paintings are really
Yes.
rough, but there's this extraordinary pictorial beauty
Yes.
that is also about joy.
Because beauty is transporting.
Because yes, it is transporting.
Julie. Julia.
Back and back questions. What age did he come here, and did the Trujillo government in any way, shape, or form actually seek out his family in particular? Or what?
He came here.
He was
either
18.
18, right? Because I was either
1963.
17 or 18, and it was just at the end of the official Trujillato with the assassination 61. But we know that Trujillato continued under Balaguer.
Yeah.
And so he was getting to a lot of
Yeah, he
issues
was out
with the students.
protesting.
He was out protesting, and so the family sent him here.
Yeah, the mother was like, you have to leave.
Yeah, you have to leave.
Just to stay alive. Right? And he actually ended up in jail.
And of course-
Family members were in prison.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
mentioned that too. And keep in mind when he was born, right? He's born in 45, right? So the Trujillo dictatorship is in place since the early 30s through 61. So his entire childhood, was under the Trujillato. So that was something that was a very concrete kind of experience of that level of oppression.
And there was a requirement to have that in esta
The
casa,
plaque,
right?
yeah.
The
En
plaque.
esta
and
casa
the
Trujillo
host.
fue
Yeah.
jefe, which we showed at the Jersey City show because he had the plaque from his home. Yeah.
I'm wondering, I'm looking at time. How are we? Does anybody have any other questions? Or everybody wanted to get up, have a glass of wine, water, whatever, and chat? Or I don't know if there's something else that you think we should cover specifically.
Well, the only thing that I would add is his sense of humor. His sense of humor is also profoundly embedded in his paintings.
Yes.
And there's almost this satirical way in which he deals with the nature of abstraction too. So it's important to pay attention to that. You see it, it's there. He was just an extraordinary artist and an extraordinary human being. We can say a lot of great artists, like for example, Caravaggio's a great artist, but I wouldn't want to leave my children with him. But when you meet an artist who is also an extraordinary human being, I think that's something, that's a
Yeah.
true blessing. And that's the case of Freddy.
So true.
It was terrific. Thanks so much.
I've been sitting here remembering a day that I don't know how many years ago, because when I started my career working with Latino artists, whatever word you want to slip in there, I went to visit you at your home, and it was a home of. Well, I guess the bottom line is that to me, Freddy was a real revelation because, yes, I knew he was a painter, but first of all, he was one of the most gentlemanly men I have ever met in my life. An old-fashioned 19th century gentleman. And then he was so knowledgeable about everything, and you'd never learn anything from him directly about him expounding about anything. He would make an allusion to something, and you'd understand what you were saying. The connections that he made in his head in all manner of cultural forms was astonishing. And I don't know, of course, by the time I met him, he also knew the art world of New York very well, from inside out, and there was most of what he did not like, but he was just so scholarly in the most profound and beautiful way, and a historian.
Yeah.
And I just want to thank both of you at everything to do with his getting to be known at the end of his life. Unfortunately, it was so late, but
he was able to have some great satisfactions.
Oh, yes.
He knew, and I was so important. I know he was in hospice, and I was able to call and leave a message and say that one of his paintings, the Tondo, was sold to the National Gallery. So he knew.
He did. He always knew
Yeah.
this would happen.
But this is, and also a beautiful, very large-scale painting just went to the Guggenheim. I mean, that was in the works for a while, but then until it could be announced and whatever, yeah.
Exactly. So there you go. All those interconnections. I would just add to what Susana said that the grace and the elegance that the paintings have was who he was as a person, right? I mean, you know, like I said, he dressed, he was el presidente de la República. I mean, with just this exquisite sense of elegance and class. But also, he was one of the most generous and warmest people. I mean, I'm of the generation that I would take my kids on studio visits. And I mean, he adored my son David, always would come. And, you know, my daughter. And I think that tells you something also about a man, that it's not just about playing, being the artist. You know, Freddie was a great dad, a great husband.
Yes.
And I remember many a time a studio visit was like, okay, you know, you got to be out of here by 2:00 because I got to go with the girls. Got to pick them up. They got to go here. They got to go there.
And we all had to sit at the table for dinner
Yeah.
and talk
Yes.
to each other, which doesn't happen
And
these
anymore.
days.
Yeah.
So it was a
It was
good life.
one of the greatest conversationalists.
Yes, absolutely.
I've ever, you know, it's an art that in general has been lost.
Yeah.
But you could listen to him for many hours. He always had interesting things and connections, and his love of you and the girls was so
Yeah, constant.
inspiring.
Good. Well, thank you all for being here, for
Thank you.
coming. It's so nice. Thank you.
Thank you.